Welcome, everyone. So my name is Jennifer Hall-Witt, and I am a senior program manager at the Karuna Center for Peace Building in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I would like to introduce our two speakers. They are here as part of a Brave Schools program. We are working closely with 8 schools in Western Massachusetts. Some of you may be parents at some of our participating schools, or you may have heard about this in some other way. We welcome all of you. And so let me just introduce our two speakers. On the far right here, of my right, is Robert Örell. Robert has more than 2 decades of experience in the field of preventing violent extremism, working on the disengagement, rehabilitation, and reintegration of violent extremists in Europe and in the United States. He's a Swedish citizen and got involved with the Swedish White Power movement in his early teens. After working with an organization called Exit Sweden, which helped him to leave neo-Nazism behind, he then became the director of Exit Sweden and helped hundreds of people separate from white supremacist gangs. Currently, he works as a senior international expert on capacity development, training, and setting up exit programs, and co-teaches a course on the psychology of violence and hate, addressing violent radicalization and violent extremism. He's also a member of the steering committee of the European Commission's Radicalization Awareness Network. I would also like to introduce Tony McAleer. Tony is the author of a book called The Cure for Hate. He's an international speaker focused on educating individuals, families, communities, law enforcement, and governments that are working with white supremacist movements. Tony co-founded the not-for-profit Life After Hate, an organization that helps people leave white supremacist movements behind, drawing on his own journey of leaving a hate-based organization. In his youth and early adulthood, Tony was the leader of one of the largest Canadian neo-Nazi skinhead organizations, the Aryan Resistance Movement, and an organizer for the White Aryan Resistance and Aryan Nations. He was also a Holocaust denier. And then in the mid-1990s, Tony began his journey out of violent extremism. Today, his experience is shaped by over 1,000 hours of individual and group counseling that has led to a deep understanding of how people are drawn into these movements and how to reconnect them with their humanity and with society at large. He has worked closely with law enforcement and governments, helping the US and other countries deal with the rising problem of white supremacist organizations. Tony has also really taken seriously the project of atoning for those who he harmed when he was a member of these groups, and has recently produced a documentary called The Cure for Hate, Bearing Witness to Auschwitz. And we'd like to just play the trailer.
What was unthinkable a generation ago is happening. The Holocaust is fading from memory. According to a recent survey, 41% of American adults and 66% of millennials cannot say what Auschwitz was. With over half unaware that Hitler came to power through democratic means, a lesson that Western democracies, perhaps now more than ever, cannot afford to forget. 20 years ago, I was a fervent neo-Nazi and Holocaust denier.
So what does all this say about Tony McAleer? How much of a threat is he?
I believe there are differences between the races. If that makes me a racist, then I'm a racist.
This is McAleer in 1990.
It's a life I've long left behind, but I continue to struggle with my role in contributing to such a dark legacy, and the shame I still carry. The violence and murder the white supremacist movement fantasized about all those years ago, the violence I once advocated and encouraged, have now become a horrific reality, as acts of racially motivated terrorism have increasingly become the norm. In the Jewish tradition, tshuva means return, and describes the return to God and our fellow human beings that's made possible through repentance for our wrongs. It was in that spirit that I traveled to Auschwitz, to bear witness to the unspeakable atrocities committed there, as a long overdue act of personal atonement, and in hopes of preventing others from following in my path. The inescapable truth is that white supremacist ideology, if left unchecked, always ends in murder, and we ignore the lessons of history at our own peril.
All right, so with that, I'm going to pass it on to Tony and Robert.
So I think to start this discussion, we're going to start with talking about how young people are drawn into these groups, and then we'll sort of deal with the specifics of online a little later. So there's a quote that I'd like to share to set the frame, and the quote is it's an old African proverb, and I think it's very rich in wisdom. A child not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And the meaning of that really is that, and the common misconception is that people are drawn into these movements because of the ideology. And the ideology really is a pill one has to swallow to get deeper needs met. And those needs are belonging, purpose, a sense of community, a sense of meaning, a sense of significance. And so we adopt different masks and different beliefs and different things in order to get accepted. And the story I'd like to share with you to begin with, as I was a co-founder of Life After Hate, and I think by 2015, we had helped 100 people leave these groups behind. By the time Charlottesville rolled around 2017, that number had grown to about 700. And we started to deal a lot with families after Charlottesville. And I got a letter from a woman whose son was neurodivergent and had Asperger's syndrome was I think his diagnosis. And he was spending a lot of time up in his room online and involved with these white nationalist groups. And she didn't know what to do. And she was really terrified and concerned for her son. And she said to me, she said, what really scares me is the white nationalists have accepted and embraced my son in a way that no one has in his entire life. And she recounted a story that when he was 12 in grade 7, that he'd invited the entire class to come to his birthday party. And because he was different, nobody showed up. And you think about what that must feel like to be that child, that sense of loneliness, that sense of unworthiness, unlovable, and it's from that deficit that these white nationalists exploited and love bombed the child and embraced him in a way that no one had in his entire life. And I think that child would believe the earth was flat if that's what it took to get that sense of community and belonging and acceptance. He would have believed anything. And so that's what I mean by the ideology as a wrapper. It's a pill we swallow in order to get those deeper needs met. I'm going to pass over to Robert now to talk about the next section.
Well, thank you, Tony. And I think we have a few things prepared. We want to share a little bit about how people are formed in violent extremist or violent radicalized environments to give an idea of how the process looks like, or what are the different areas that we see young people are affected in when they join these groups. But we also want to make sure to discuss the importance of both online and offline aspects of joining these groups. Since the internet, all kinds of groups are active online, and for the violent extremists, violent radicalized groups, this really offered an enormous platform to reach people in a way they couldn't really reach before. All kinds of views are available, all kinds of ideas, and for these groups, it became a strong platform to usually uncensored reach out with their ideas to recruit young people. And what's important to know is that in many cases, it's not obvious for the young people who are recruited that they're recruited to a violent radicalized environments or that these ideas are there, but it could really be as simple as that they're invited to a separate, small, closed group in a chat forum where they are introduced to new friends. And there's a strong sense of community, usually a lot of fun, a lot of sarcasms, and it's not clear that this is related to any ideology at all in the beginning, which is a way to lure and introduce young people to these groups. And only after a while, it becomes clear for the young person that there's an ideology in this group. There's an ideology and a purpose or an idea to form people once you're in the group. It's quite similar to the offline recruitment as well. Very few groups would stand with a copy of Mein Kampf on the town square to recruit people and say, read this and let's discuss what you think, but much more covert type of recruitment that you would offer a strong sense of belonging and community, and then slowly you would reveal the views and you would share the views of the group. I'll share an offline example of this, which is a group that a person I worked with in my career at Exit Sweden. I helped somebody to leave a group in a Swedish context. The group was active in a smaller city in mid-Sweden. The group consisted of 10 to 12 persons who were in their early 20s. They were practicing martial arts. They were a bit of the cool gang or the cool group in the town. And they had a strategy of how to recruit people to their Nazi community. They had access to a house and they arranged parties in this house. They arranged 4 parties in a row where they invited hand-picked young Swedish males, so young guys, and they invited them for the party. The first Saturday, it was all fun and game. It was booze and hanging with this elderly cool guys, and there was a lot of tapping on the back and having a good atmosphere and just feeling that it's so good to be here. The second weekend in a row, they had a new party, invited same group, booze, atmosphere. They put up a Swedish flag on the wall, and they talked about the beauty of Sweden and how important country Sweden is. And then the third weekend, third Saturday in a row, a new party, Saturday evening. This time, they had a bit of kind of rock music with not really racist song, but more nationalist song. And they talked about the beauty of Sweden and how important it is to preserve the Swedish culture and how what threats we're facing right now with migration and immigration and democracy and the challenges of society. And then the fourth weekend in a row, the fourth Saturday, they revealed themselves as Nazis. They had Nazi symbols on the wall, they played white power music, and they talked about the importance of preserving the white race. So during this month, they very slowly introduced these young people to a strong community and slowly showed or revealed their true colors in that sense. So this is what we usually see in terms of recruitment when it comes to both online and offline settings to these groups. Some of the things that we can be observant of as parents is the importance of talking with our children, to have dialogue with them, to talk about what type of interest they have, what type of pages they're on, what type of information is going on. And this might sometimes be difficult. Being a parent of a teenager myself, I know that it's not always that my teenager opens up about everything that happens. So we can also think of, do we have other people in the family or around that can help us to also ensure that there's a strong connection and contact with our child? To think of other significant persons around us who might be helpful and might be able to support in this process. So I would strongly recommend that.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. It's so important to be, and the earlier you start, the better, is to be really curious about who your child is, and how your child sees themselves in the world. Because honestly, the best method here is prevention. We cannot stop our children from interacting with other people. And now it's online. When I was young, it was, you never knew who they were going to meet at the mall, and you got to be careful of going to the mall. It's a little bit different being online, but we can't always stop our children from meeting people that they shouldn't meet. It's much better to inoculate them in order to be able to recognize and identify bad actors that are trying to contact them. And when I talk about bad actors, the people that might recruit them or groom them are not middle-aged men. They're going to be 13 and 14-year-olds. They're going to be 18 and 19-year-olds. They're going to be in their early 20s. And often through the gaming platforms, and I know I'm a gamer, you'll get, clans. That's clan with a C. In the online gaming space, which are groups of players that come together and they form sort of a community, and they get tags after their names, and they go and play other clans, and there's prestige involved with that. And if you get to put that clan name after your name, it can be a status symbol and such like that. And that's how they invite people in to these groups. And everything from World of Warcraft to you name the game, there's clans of young men and women that are ideologically driven behind the scenes. And once you're inside those clans, you can become officers, and there's another layer of secrecy and prestige, and so it can be very seductive to get drawn into these. But most clans are benign, right? So it's I don't know that it's helpful to say, well, you can't join a clan in the gaming environment. It's empowering the child to know what to look for. And it's also being back to the curiosity piece and having a relationship with your child and being curious about who they are in the world and how they see themselves in the world, that you can pick up when those attitudes about themselves or how they perceive the world start to change. And you can then sort of start to intervene. If you sort of wait until your child comes home with a fash haircut and a slogan on the t-shirt, it's probably too late. I can't stress enough how important it is to engage with your child with curiosity very, very early on.
And so talking about children and your children and identifying risks, we would really want to encourage to think of different type of symbols or code words that are usually used in these type of groups. The most common one could be, for example, number combinations. For example, there's a number 1 and 8, so 18, which stands for the first and the 8th letter in the alphabet. And in a Nazi kind of symbolism, this would be a shortening for Adolf Hitler. So users who are active in this group would, for example, have names that called, their names and then 18, for example, or whatever they want to identify with an 18 at the end to identify that they're also part of this type of movement. And similarly, 88 would be then 2H, so that would be short for Heil Hitler, which is very commonly used in these type of groups and environments to identify to others who are also part of this group, that you signal to others that you're part of the same environment. There's a range of different symbols and codes. We didn't think that we would go through all of them, but we really encourage that you look online. There's some really good resources. The SPLC and the ADL both has resources online. So if you Google SPLC hate database, you will get the symbols and such. So look around if you're concerned. And if you are concerned over your child, try to look for these type of indications. Is there writings on the bag or clothes or on, something that reoccurs, a symbol? Be curious, ask about it, and try to find out information online if this is something that you have concern over. Just to give examples from my practice, I talked with parents who saw names written on backpacks, for example, which showed to be names of school shooters. And this is an indication. If we see this, it's an indication and you will have to react on it. You will have to seek help. And with this, we also want to encourage that to think of that you're not alone. You shouldn't be alone. I experienced a lot of families who felt a strong sense of shame and stigma, and they didn't really want to talk about this with others because it's difficult to talk about your child and engagement in these groups, but that's not going to be helpful for you. But try instead to identify people near you who you can open up to and discuss, if this is friends or family or professionals. And if you're really concerned, I mean, preferably reach out to a professional, a social worker, somebody in the school of your child, or somebody who could help you to move forward with this so that you're not alone with it. I think we really want to encourage people to not be alone with this type of concerns or fears. All right, so we prepared a few slides for you, and let's go further. We wanted to present very briefly just a bit of the mindset and mentality of violent radicalization. So how are individuals formed in these groups? And this is to inform both what we can identify and recognize, but also what we can work with when we see this with young people. So the first is really what we see as black and white thinking. So categorized black and white thinking, where young people or people involved in violent extremist or violent radicalized groups usually see things very black and white. Categorized, us and them, right and wrong. People are either with us or against us. There's the chosen ones and there's the traitors. So this type of thinking. We have to also distinguish, though, that people can have these ideas or this way of seeing things without necessarily being in violent radicalized groups. But this is a vulnerability, a risk factor that we identify. The second one is distance or sense of superiority, so that you feel that you're superior or you create distance towards other people and you don't really engage, which creates a bit of a barrier to interact and engage with other people. You look at other people as different, as somebody you cannot really relate or understand to. You see others as enemies or as faults. Here it's really important to think of how to close the gap. How do we create closer relations or less distance, so we don't let the child isolate themselves in these groups, to not let these groups be the only ones who are around these groups. And the third is isolation, that these groups usually isolate, not always physical on a farm, on the countryside, but mentally for sure. They isolate themselves in the groups to not let external information in and affect you. We are all familiar with the concept of fake news, for example. You can invalidate everything that comes from the outside as fake if it's not from your in-group. And these groups are very good at creating that type of system. So you isolate in the group. And here it's important with alternative information, with sources of interaction to connect with new and other information, and not let the child isolate in the group. Dehumanization fills the function if we want to commit violence towards others. It's usually difficult to do this if there's somebody we trust, somebody we have close relation to, somebody we respect, but it's much more easier if we have a black and white thinking of right and wrong, we have a sense of superior, we isolate in our in-group, and we take away the human values of the enemies, the perceived enemies. They're no longer humans, but they're apes or rats or cockroaches or something that's not human. And here it's important to think of how to contradict this. So what examples can we identify to contradict this type of idea and mindset? And then the last is the validation of violence. So these groups validate violence as a way to achieve a higher cause. They validate the use of violence through talking about revenge. You have to revenge on people who did you wrong, or it's our turn to have power, or such a thing. So here we identify fascinations for violence and weapons or perceived strength or such. And we have to be a bit careful with these things. So we wanted to share these just as ideas of how do we understand involvement in these groups? How are young people shaped in their mindset and mentality? And what can we do to work with this? Yeah, good. Is there any questions so far? We've been going on now for a while.
Any questions online?
I guess I have one thought that goes with the, how do you recognize it with one question I have, you've answered it, a lot of it already with things I couldn't even think of, but how would I know if my child was in danger? I understand that what you said about looking for symbols and isolation, not all these kinds of thinking, but I'm also aware in our culture, there's this sort of sacred thing of protecting the privacy of teenagers. So it's a problem. So I'm just thinking about if my child were isolated, how would I know if he was isolated or she was isolated, or they would just needed some time alone? Can you talk at all about that part of it?
So I think here the key is really that it is not always wrong to be isolated. And a lot of people are isolated without ever engaging with violent extremist groups. I think it's really the combination of is there isolation and other risk factors and some type of, I mean, you know, we cannot know if there's no signals of this. So can we see any type of signs or discussions? Do we see a change in opinions or behaviors at home? So what type of things do we see at home that indicates any type of change? Yeah.
Yeah, I think if your child is spending a lot of time on their own and then you notice behavioral changes that go with it, we can't always live in fear and protect them from everything out there. That isn't always helpful, but and if they're in isolation all the time, like the example I gave you, the child was up in the bedroom and the parent noticed things that were going on, and then reached out to us to intervene. But that mother knew her child and had enough of a relationship with the child that she could tell when something was amiss. Curiosity, courage, compassion. So this next quote is by Dr. James Gilligan, and I think it's very relevant. Dr. James Gilligan was a forensic psychiatrist. I think he's retired now, in the California federal penitentiary system. And I think in the 20 years that he was a forensic psychiatrist in that prison, he said, I don't think I ever came across or was aware of a serious act of violence that wasn't rooted in shame and humiliation. And that all violence is an attempt to convert shame into self-esteem. He wrote a great book called Violence: Reflections on a National Epidemic. And I think it's again bringing us back to the understanding that below the surface, when we need to engage in people that are in the world of violence, in the world of violent extremism, there's much deeper issues that we need to tackle. And I think this graphic, this picture, really illustrates it well. We can see the first picture of the person who's not happy and is discontented. What's below that? And below that is anger. And when we peel away that layer, we get down to what's below the anger, hurt. And when we get drill down to an even further level, we get to what's behind the hurt. And often it's the wounded inner child. And when I think of, white nationalists at some rally with the shield and the clubs and all of that, in my mind, I picture a wounded 2-year-old having a temper tantrum in a grown man's body. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that there's probably nothing more dangerous than a wounded 2-year-old having a temper tantrum in a grown man's body. But at the root of this antisocial behavior is the wounded child. And if we want to deal with the anger, if we want to deal with the orange mask, or, we have to deal with the wounded child. And, that's where we can start to interact with our children. If we can do that in a healthy way, because if we're honest, some of the dysfunction in a child's life comes from the family unit itself. And so sometimes we need to get outside help to help us intervene and work with our children.
Yeah, indeed. And I think when we encounter young people who are very angry, it's important to try to be able to cope with that. It's always uncomfortable and difficult to manage aggression. But when it comes to young children and our children, and seeing these type of behaviors or attitudes, it's really important to try to, as much as possible, be calm and to try to understand what the underlying reason for this is. Thinking of this picture, for example, if there's a lot of anger, why is this? Is there frustration? Is there fear? Is there stress? What is it that lies underneath? To engage not only with the secondary emotion, which is what we engage with, but also the primary emotion that often leads to this or is behind this. So to engage with this. This is also a lot of the work that we've done within Exit and supporting people to lead. So yeah, we wanted to share these perspectives and think a little bit about what is the importance when it comes to engaging and preventing involvement or preventing further escalation into these type of environments.
So we have a question from one of our online viewers. Could you speak about fostering pride and a sense of belonging in one's heritage, one's ethnicity, one's ancestry? Could you talk about kind of pride in one's own ancestry as a kind of anti-racist act that resists nationalism and white supremacy? But could you just sort of expand on that idea a little bit?
Well, I think it's important to understand that in healthy pride, healthy pride doesn't involve putting other races or cultures or ethnicities down. And, as much as, and Frank Mink, one of the co-founders of Life After Hate, is so apt to say, you can only talk about Leif Erikson so long. And then all of a sudden, we have to start putting down the other race. That's the reality. It's not about pride. And when we understand, go back to James Gilligan's quote, where, shame is at the root of violence. Shame is at the root of, violent racism, overt racism. And we're not talking about implicit bias, but we're talking about overt visceral racism. And, and I just quickly talk about shame here for a second, because I'll make it relevant. Healthy shame is I did bad, I did wrong. Toxic shame is I am bad, I am wrong. Toxic shame is the feeling of less than, being not good enough, not smart enough, not pretty enough, unlovable, invisible, powerless, weak. And we live our lives in reaction to that. Behind almost every perfectionist is someone who deep down at a subconscious level feels deeply flawed. Behind almost every overachiever is someone who feels that they have to prove to the world how worthy they are by overachieving to compensate for this feeling of being less than and less worthy. I adopted an ideology that told me I was greater than to compensate for the feeling of less than. And, you know, the ego and the mind works in polarities. And so a question I'll ask you is, what's a word that's the opposite of shame? It's pride. I'm proud of my race. Proud Boys. White pride worldwide. And so when the pride is born of toxic shame, it's a toxic pride. Right? And healthy shame, I mean, healthy pride is inclusive, and it doesn't put other people down. With a healthy pride, you can celebrate other people's cultures as well as your own. And I think that's what I would have to say about that pride piece.
All right, let's see here. So thinking of yeah, question?
So I'm a parent. I have a 18-year-old and an almost 20-year-old. And I've been hearing from a lot of teachers that we've been talking to, you know, about Andrew Tate. And, you know, a lot of his videos seem to be circulating on social media, you know, with pretty strong statements of misogyny. You know, even my own kids, I asked them the other day, and they knew exactly who he was. They had watched, you know, his videos. And so, you know, I really hear you that, you know, kids who, you know, have a pretty healthy kind of ego, they don't have a lot of toxic shame, they're going to be probably inoculated to that. But I guess what my question is if you could talk a little bit about masculinity, you know, because there's a lot that's circulating these days. It doesn't seem to be such a kind of a healthy notion of masculinity, and it's circulating widely enough that you know, I know for myself, I feel a little concerned about what might sort of seep in because it just gets normalized. And it's, you know, this is the kind of stuff that kids are getting exposed to online. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and, you know, how parents might, you know, handle that.
This isn't an absolute rule, but I think it's preferable for a father to have that discussion with a son. Just as I think it's preferable for a mother to have a conversation with a daughter about periods. There's a comfort level and a knowledge level there that's a little bit different. I think it's very difficult. It would be very difficult for a mother to have that conversation with a young man who's looking at that stuff because of the implicit nature of that stuff. But we live in a world where healthy masculinity isn't defined. You know, we live in a world where there's often an absence of healthy male role models. And so it's how do we compensate for that? And you know, with masculinity, there isn't a whole lot of discussion. There's a lot of talk about toxic masculinity, but there isn't a whole lot of discussion about healthy masculinity. And I think it's important that young men have healthy masculine male role models for it to be modeled from, because in the absence of that, they will get drawn to things like Andrew Tate and other unhealthy models of masculinity. And I think this is sort of part of a larger societal problem. But it's how do we have these discussions about what healthy masculinity is? That's so important.
Yeah, I think I think you're right, Tony, in the sense that who has these type of discussions and when do we have these discussions? I want to share a practice from so the program I worked for was part of a youth center that had a range of different practices. Many employees working with different type of programs, and one of them was a project called Bridge Builders. I think probably originally inspired from a US program and then started in Sweden. And how it developed and evolved in the Swedish context was really that it was a group where young teenage boys were introduced to a group that met regularly and did activities. And in all the activities, there was dedicated time to talk about values, to talk about courage, to talk about role, to talk about identity. And I think in a lot of our communities, we don't really have that space where we actually address and we talk about this, but it's formed through media or social media or internet or peers, but not really in an organized way. I think in that sense, groups like the Scouts or other similar groups really fill a form and a function where you have these gatherings and you do activities together and you form a group, you make it comfortable to share and talk, and you address things like ethics, morals, and such. And I think this doesn't have to be done only in projects like the Scouts or the Bridge Builders. Actually, at that youth center, there was a basketball team, one of the biggest basketball teams in Stockholm, gathered, I think, around 10,000 people who were engaged in basketball from kind of first year trying out to an elite team. And they decided very consciously to name themselves also human rights. So in the name, the club had human rights as part of the name of the basketball team. And they dedicated every training to have a short session on exactly these things: values, group identity. And I think it's not actually much more difficult than this, that all kinds of group or gatherings or sports or communities, it's not so difficult to dedicate, a part of every meeting, 10, 15 minutes, to dedicate to these type of questions, which otherwise are a bit left outside of most school curriculums, perhaps not really talked about at home, and otherwise fostered in the, amongst peers. And as we heard from the question, I mean, from internet influences, I think we as an adult, as communities, as a range of different groups, can really step up and take on this. How do we talk about these things in an everyday setting? I'm sure that this can be done in so many different type of groups and communities where young people gather and meet.
Question, but okay, just what I heard from this school here actually was in a preliminary discussion, thinking about ways of trying to promote sort of positive masculinity and using sports teams, using the macho guys of trying to change the culture. And I don't know, which I think is a great idea. I mean, I think it's not that complicated, but I don't know whether you guys have encountered any other positive examples that you might share of, whether in schools or outside of schools, of trying to foster a more positive as opposed to toxic masculinity.
I mean, I think that this can be done once again in terms of organized sessions, preferably perhaps peer groups led by an adult mentor or at least supervised by adult mentors, where you bring up and discuss these things. I'm sure that it's possible to do and to engage with these questions like this.
Yeah, team sports is a huge way to do that. And I remember at the all boys Catholic school I went to as a kid, there was a very big sports focus at the school, and the sort of motto of the school is there's two types of boys: athletes and bad boys. Right? In the absence of being involved in sport, the kids got into trouble, and the energy went into a different place. But I think of all the things that my son learned playing sort of hockey at an elite level, and it doesn't have to be elite level, about self-discipline and work ethic and camaraderie and bonding with other young men and that type of thing was really transformative for him.
It's something I think about a lot, and as a member of this community for a long time, I want to give a shout out also to our theater company, the people who run our musical programs and the extracurriculars that aren't sports based, because I do think those people have very high rapport with our kids, and though they are in situations all the time that you have to solve problems with value sets, you're not just, it's happening. So I just want to give a shout out because we have great people in our town. Yeah.
And I just want to agree with you here that it's not about sports, it's about where young people gather to have organized activities, and there's adults leader, all of those settings. Indeed, I think thinking a bit forward, perhaps we just show just a few more slides, and if there's no more questions, I think we look there. But the next slide is.
This is one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Martin Luther King, and it's, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." And that's so powerful, and with the work that we do. Shame is at the root of the problem. How can shame possibly be part of the answer? And the answer is it's not. And so that's a very, very deep and powerful quote.
And then the next slide really is informed from the perspectives of preventing and countering violent extremism and violence in general, that we see what are the key focuses to build successful responses. And one is to really understand the lived through experiences of the persons that we want to reach. So what have they gone through? How do they perceive these experiences, and how can we look at their understanding from a lens that resonates with them, instead of coming from a kind of a different lens, telling people that this is wrong or you shouldn't do this. Instead, how can we step into their shoes to understand what is it that they're going through, and how can we create something that resonates with this. The importance of when we want to change, when we want to create change, we have to have a strong relation. It has to be some type of trust building before. So if this is not there, we have to start with working with this. So if there's, and all of us who had teenage children knows that the teenagers want to be independent, and they can be quite a distance. So if we want to create change, we have to think of how do we bridge this? How do we work first with creating trust and a close relation before we start coming with all these wise words, or we want to come with all these life lessons or create change. It's really important, and this could be difficult sometimes to be non-judgmental and non-confrontational when we engage with content or ideas that are very foreign to our own perceptions or our own values. But to apply this practice is usually important, because we can go to ourselves and think, how would we react if someone comes up to us and is judgmental or confrontational, and how much does this lead us to change? So relating a bit to our own yeah, okay. I do it this time. So we collected a few quotes, as you saw, quotes that we think resonate with our messages and our trainings and our what we want to promote simply. And Khalil Gibran is one of the fantastic authors who said in one of his texts the following quote: "And God said, love your enemy. I obeyed him, and I loved myself." And when we think of this quote, and we think of how this resonates with young people, the importance of giving space to grow, to make sure that young people can be comfortable, to have self-acceptance, strong self-identity, we see that this is very important. And the next slide, the next quote is from a French 18th century moral philosopher, Joseph Joubert, who said that the aim of argument or of discussion should not be victory, but progress. And everybody who has ever been in a discussion knows that it's usually difficult to change somebody over a few sentences or over a discussion, but it takes time. So what we should aim for is to help people to grow and to discover more rather than to prove that we are right and they are wrong. Finally, we wanted to promote on the next slide that both of us had a chance to do TED Talks, which are available online on YouTube. So if you search for either our names on YouTube, you can see TED Talks where we address these themes of violent extremism, the mindset of violent extremism, and compassion, and how we can respond in a constructive way to involvement in these groups. So we wanted to share these resources, which is available online for free. And kind of wrapping up last words from my end would really be, we know that it's very difficult when your child is at risk for these groups or potentially involved here, but we also encourage you not to be alone with this. So seek support, seek help, talk with people you trust around you to get more resources and get support. Reach out to professionals, to social workers, to community organizations, to people around you that you trust and to get support. And think of who are the important people around your child or your loved one that you can engage, who you can see might have a positive influence on that person, to help them to grow and to develop in a constructive way.
And lastly, I'll just add, just to remind everybody about the three C's. And if we can engage our children and embrace the 3 C's, in fact, if we can engage the world and embrace the 3 C's. And 3 C's are curiosity, which you've gone over, courage. Some of these conversations require a great deal of courage, and we can never forget compassion. Curiosity, courage, and compassion. And I think if we embody those 3 words into our daily practice of life and our daily interactions with our children, we can change the world.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. On behalf of the Karuna Center, we want to let you know that we are, delighted that you came. Tony and Robert are going to be coming back to this area in the fall, and we are hoping to do some more parent nights at other schools in the region. And so I would just welcome your input if you have, as for those of you who are parents, especially if you are local. I would love for you to kind of let other parents know that there are going to be more parent nights coming up. And also, if you have input for the kinds of things that you would like more information about, now that you know a little bit about Robert and Tony, you have a sense of their expertise. So my email, and maybe Laura can put it in the chat, but my email is Jennifer, JENNIFER @karunacenter.org. Karuna is KARUNA. karunacenter.org. So again, thank you so much for coming. And we hope that we will see you again next fall. Thanks.